Hello, nerds. You know the title. You know what this is about. If you've paid attention at all in the past month or so to all the buzz about Mike Flanagan and the Dark Tower intellectual property, you know that he has done some work to acquire the rights to Stephen King's The Dark Tower series. Now, this is big news because this is a fantasy series that spans decades, spans several different books, and that no doubt people have been hoping for a worthwhile quality screen adaptation for a long time. We got an attempted screen adaptation back in 2017. It was pretty bad, to be generous, and left a lot to be desired. Essentially, they tried to take all 7 books from the series, condense it down into one movie, and the movie also tried to operate not only as the series itself, but also a sequel to the books. So there was just a lot going on, a lot getting muddled, but now it may be in better hands. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today, as well as some of the people we would like to see portray our favorite characters in Mike Flanagan's Dark Tower series. Familiar with Stephen King's work, but you've never read The Dark Tower, it's kind of hard to boil down what The Dark Tower is all about and sort of what the point is into bullet points. But if I were to try to do that, I would say that the Dark Tower in this universe, the tower itself, is sort of like the bathtub stopper, the linchpin of all universes. And essentially, with there being this sort of like multiverse in Stephen King's universe, the Dark Tower is at the center of everything. The Dark Tower, being the center of all universes, is under attack, and our hero Roland just knows that he is sort of heading towards the Dark Tower to see what's inside in order to save it, to defend it, and you get to know everything else along the way. But that's sort of like the boiled down purpose of the Dark Tower. So if you're unsure of who Mike Flanagan is, if you have a Netflix subscription, you've probably come across a couple of his shows, series, and movies that he's done. And he's not only had some of his own work, but he's also adapted some of Stephen King's novels into movies as well. So if you're familiar with things like The Haunting of Hill House, The Haunting of Bly Manor, The Midnight Club, Midnight Mass, as well as some of Stephen King's own work like Gerald's Game and Dr. Sleep, then you know Mike Flanagan. It feels like after an interview on Deadline, which I'll link down in the description, came out on December 8th, that this Dark Tower series is in good hands with Mike Flanagan. There's no doubt that he has some talent in not only taking Stephen King's source work and creating a reasonable facsimile of what dedicated Stephen King readers want to see on the screen. He also, in that interview, talked about how passionate he's been about not only Stephen King's work, but specifically about the Dark Tower, saying that he sort of had that opening scene in his head since he read the books back when he was a kid. So this is a guy who is passionate about Stephen King's work and who clearly has an idea of what direction he wants to move when it comes to the Dark Tower series, which I think the 2017 film adaptation from Ron Howard was the exact opposite of. Let's talk about who we potentially want to see in Mike Flanagan's adaptation of The Dark Tower. From Screen Rant, they came up with a list of different candidates for a couple different roles, and the first person they named, one I've seen from a number of different people, a number of different sources that want to see this particular actor playing Roland Deschain, the main character in the Dark Tower series, is Ewan McGregor, who you may know as Obi-Wan from the Obi-Wan series or from the prequel trilogy from Star Wars. He also played Danny Torrance in Mike Flanagan's adaptation of Dr. Sleep. So this is somebody who has some familiarity not only working with Mike Flanagan, but also working in the Stephen King universe. I think it's an interesting choice. I don't think when I think of Roland Deschain that Ewan McGregor or Obi-Wan's face is like the first one that comes to mind in that case, but I can kind of see it. If you think of like a grizzled version of Obi-Wan or of Ewan McGregor, you know, something in between what he looks like in Dr. Sleep and what he looks like in the different Star Wars adaptations. You can kind of see it, like 5 o'clock shadow, maybe some stubble, the long hair, the cowboy hat. If you have read the actual books that include illustrations, there is some resemblance to the rendition that they made of Roland Deschain in those books and Ewan McGregor. So that could be an interesting choice. There's a real complexity that comes with Roland Deschain that maybe Ewan McGregor can tackle, but he is probably not the first person I think of when I think of Roland Deschain from the Dark Tower series. And another one that Scree Rant talks about as a potential pick for Roland Deschain is Bruce Greenwood, who seems kind of old for Roland Deschain in my mind at this point. If you have seen Flanagan's adaptation of Gerald's Game, you know that Bruce Greenwood plays Gerald in Gerald's Game, plays that husband. I don't know if he comes to mind as someone who would portray Roland Deschain. He does have a certain like grizzled look to him that I think may fit it well, and there's definitely a lot of connections with Mike Flanagan, with the Gerald's Game adaptation, and with Flanagan's last work on Netflix, which will be coming out soon, The Fall of the House of Usher. He ended up replacing the main actor in that, so he has experience working with Mike Flanagan. But again, when I think Roland Deschain, the gunslinger, I don't know if I think old Bruce Greenwood, who at this point in time seems like he may have aged out of that role. To go from Idris Elba in the movie, which was like the first screen adaptation of The Dark Tower, to Bruce Greenwood, that leap doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Now, one that I've seen across a couple of different websites that makes a lot of sense in my mind is this pick, Timothy Olyphant. He is that like picturesque Western hero, and when I connect the illustrations of Roland Deschain and I think of like what I would want to see out of Mike Flanagan's adaptation of this, he is somebody who like comes up in my mind. The way he acts, things start to connect in my brain when I consider him. He was in The Mandalorian, he was in Book of Boba Fett, he was also in an FX series where he played like a Western cop, and he has played a lot of other characters that are all about that sort of like gun-toting cowboy Western hero type of vibe. So I think Timothy Olyphant would fit the role as Roland Deschain very, very well. Another one, Rahul Kohli, who played the role of sheriff in Mike Flanagan's Midnight Mass, as well as one of the characters in Haunting of Bly Manor. And I think he has fulfilled those roles amazingly, but also his very like pleasantly snarky and like lovely presence on social media. The amount I've seen of him with that doesn't like completely mesh with my conception of like who Roland Deschain is. So I don't know if he completely fulfills that sort of Roland Deschain character for me, but nonetheless, I would love to see him in the series. And it seems like across Mike Flanagan's work, he tends to include very similar cast members from show to show, so it would be awesome to see him in Flanagan's Dark Tower series. Finally, our first Susanna Dean character potential actress, Keke Palmer. And you think of Susanna Dean, if you've read the Dark Tower series, she is intelligent, capable, strong, fiery, and I'm not going to spoil anything about the series, but needs a lot of range. Her personality is extremely dynamic throughout the series, and you need somebody who can fulfill so many different emotional and sort of physical roles throughout the Dark Tower series. I feel like Keke Palmer would be amazing at that. I also think Keke Palmer is just a great emotional actor and can like hit the highest of highs, hit the lowest of lows. And I think throughout a series like this, with Susanna Dean, who is an extremely pivotal character throughout the Dark Tower series, Keke Palmer could be absolutely perfect for this. So I absolutely love this pick for Susanna Dean being Keke Palmer. Eddie Dean, another massively pivotal character. If you've read up to the second book in the Dark Tower series, The Drawing of Three, you know that Susanna and Eddie are the two characters that are sort of added into the fold in that second book. So I think this is a decent pick for it. If you know who Jeremy Allen White is from The Bear or from Shameless, and you think of that sort of like disheveled, troubled young man, and you think of who Eddie Dean is, especially right at the beginning of his introduction in the second Dark Tower book, Jeremy Allen White seems like he'd be a really solid actor for this role. This is a group that is going to sort of stick together throughout this series for the vast majority of it, and thinking of Jeremy Allen White and Keke Palmer alongside whoever plays Roland, I just feel like Keke Palmer and Jeremy Allen White together would be amazing as Eddie and Susanna. Now we have our first Walter O'Dim, Randall Flagg, Martin Broadcloak potential actor. They have Jeremy Davies, who I think, looks like played a role in The Black Phone, if you know the Joe Hill book and film adaptation, The Black Phone. People have talked about, you choose someone, for instance, in the first adaptation, like Matthew McConaughey, and there's a certain barrier you have to get over in order to be able to associate Matthew McConaughey with this identity of Randall Flagg. Like it's a decent leap you have to take. So maybe picking someone who isn't as well known can sort of allow you to position your mind in a place where you see whoever is playing Randall Flagg and you're like, okay, I can make them my villain in this series. Because if you pick Matthew McConaughey, you may immediately jump to like rom-com Matthew McConaughey or Lincoln commercial Matthew McConaughey, and all of a sudden the villain doesn't make a ton of sense in your head. So maybe picking somebody who's been associated with that kind of like darker villainous role, or just like a lesser known actor, would be a really good pick for Randall Flagg. And now we have Oi. I would assume Oi would be CGI'd in this case. Oi in the Dark Tower series is this like raccoon dog hybrid who is like the animal companion to our quartet, our group in the Dark Tower series. And they have Mark Hamill. I feel like a lot of it you wouldn't exactly need like a person to voice Oi at a ton of points, but if you want to get Mark Hamill involved with the series, I'm all for that. He's done a ton of awesome voice acting work. So Mark Hamill for Oi, I'm all for it. Now we move to Blaine the Mono. If you've read up to book 3, The Wastelands, you know that a train plays a very pivotal role, and it's like a very sassy train that gives you riddles and is very snarky. And thinking of Danny McBride's voice coming from that train and kind of messing with our group of heroes from the Dark Tower would be so delightful. I think that's a great opportunity for, although there's not a ton of like funny things happening in the Dark Tower series, it's a pretty rugged fantasy series, but having some sense of comedic relief and inserting Danny McBride in it for that Blaine the Mono role, which when you get to the Wastelands is an incredibly tense section of the series. I think that would be a good opportunity to insert somebody like Danny McBride. Maybe even Mark Hamill would be a great Blaine the Mono if you want a little bit more of a formidable and sort of creepy portrayal of Blaine the Mono, but Danny McBride would be a great choice for that as well. All right, and we'll move to a Cinema Blend article on this very topic. They talked about how Javier Bardem, if you have seen, any of the 007 movies with Daniel Craig or No Country for Old Men, Javier Bardem has played a ton of different villains in the past. He obviously has played like good guys too in movies, but I know him as like some of the scariest, most ominous villains in my sort of movie viewing history. And thinking that he was originally cast as Roland Deschain over a decade ago when Ron Howard and everyone was trying to develop that first Dark Tower movie blows my mind. I could never see Javier Bardem as Roland Deschain. Like, just trying to think of him as Roland Deschain, again, takes a massive leap given like the villain antagonist baggage that Javier Bardem brings with him into a role. So I think he would make an amazing Randall Flagg. I think he would fulfill that role like to a T. But as Roland Deschain, I don't know if I could see it. Another choice here, Hugh Jackman as Roland Deschain. Again, I feel like with some of these series, it's tough. Bring someone like Hugh Jackman, who was incredibly involved in Wolverine in the MCU back in the day. I don't know if it totally works. He has the look of Roland Deschain, especially if you think of him in his portrayal in Logan. I think he sort of fits that role really well, but I don't know if Hugh Jackman would be the best choice. Carl Urban from The Boys, one of my favorite shows at the moment, as Roland Deschain. I think this is a good one. He sort of fits in my brain. But he also seems like, The Boys is all about like anti-heroes as the protagonists. So I feel like he could play literally anything. I could see Carl Urban as Roland, I could see him as Randall Flagg, I could see him as Eddie Dean, any number of different characters I could see Carl Urban being, which speaks to his range as an actor. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see him involved in the series, especially given the Amazon ties and the fact that Flanagan is taking the Dark Tower to Amazon. Maybe we could see Carl Urban in the Dark Tower series. So clearly there are a ton of great options with actors and actresses who could fulfill these roles. I think after going through so many of those options, I have a few ideas as to people who I think would play these roles absolutely perfectly. I think in terms of Roland Deschain, that Timothy Olyphant pick just makes sense to me. Unless Idris Elba wants to come back and do it again. He's more than welcome to. I would love to see a great Dark Tower series adaptation with Idris Elba still attached. But again, given how poorly it was received the first time, there's absolutely no chance that he's coming back for that. So Timothy Olyphant, I will take him as Roland Deschain. As Randall Flagg, there were some decent ones in there, but I think the one that fits perfectly in my Dark Tower wish list brain is Willem Dafoe. I know Willem Dafoe has been cast as villains in the past, and I just feel like his facial expressions and the way he expresses emotion and that evil laugh, everything about it makes sense in connection with Randall Flagg in my head. And especially if you're going with like sort of a older casting approach to this, Timothy Olyphant isn't the youngest guy at this point, and you think about some of the other options that some of these articles talked about with Roland Deschain and Randall Flagg, I think Willem Dafoe would fit that Randall Flagg role really, really well. And then in terms of Eddie Dean, I feel like the Jeremy Allen White pick was really good. And in my head, while reading it, I pictured Eddie Dean, regardless of his description and his age and everything, as younger than Roland Deschain. And I think Jeremy Allen White next to a slightly older Roland Deschain portrayal would be really great for the series and for that sort of character dynamic between them. With Susanna, I think the Keke Palmer pick works really well. Also, I saw some people talking about Michonne from The Walking Dead, Danae Gurira. She would fit it to a T. She may be the perfect one. So maybe I'll pick her for my Susanna portrayal. But I would love to hear who you think should fulfill these primary roles in the upcoming Dark Tower adaptation. Let me know down in the comments. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe. We'll see you in the next video. Peace.